Morning, everybody. As always, if you would please turn off your cell phones, I'd greatly appreciate that. So make sure those phones are off. Well, today we're going to talk about what I refer to as Darkest Days 2. Darkest Days 2 refers to Wake Island and, of course, the much more important invasion of the Philippines. So with that said, let's get started. Well, I know you've never seen this map before, but once again, we're at the first day of the war. And of course, when I use this map, I show you that big red arrow, and that red arrow is the sea lane between the southern resource area where they've got all those goodies, and of course, where Japan is. So that's the sea route that they're going to need to get their goods from the southeast area up to Japan. I also have a black circle around the Philippine Islands. The Philippine Islands, of course, could be used to interdict that sea lane. And the Japanese assume, probably correctly, that indeed we will try to interdict that sea lane. They basically realize that they feel too is the war is inevitable. There's no way there's not going to be this war. So they know that they have to take the Philippines, which is the biggest reason why they attack us in Pearl Harbor. They're also going to have to attack Guam, which is the yellow circle there, and Wake Island. And the reason they're going to do that is, again, they're going to use those places as unsinkable aircraft carriers. So when the U.S. fleet would come across the Pacific heading west to relieve the Philippines, indeed, they would use air power and submarines to try to weaken our fleet. So that's always the goal here. So basically look at Wake and Guam as defensive perimeters. I guess that's the best way to put it. Well, let us start with Wake Island. Wake Island is initially not a military base. Wake Island is actually a base for the Pan Am Clipper, which is a seaplane. It's used for transportation of civilians. It's like a commercial airliner, really, at this time. And the idea is it doesn't have the range to fly from, the United States all the way to Asia. So they need places to stop in the way there. And they use Wake Island because Wake Island is an atoll. So it is protected waters. And so I put a red arrow there. That is where the seaplane would land, in between those islands. So it's protected from the ocean waves. They also built a little hotel there. So people would fly in, they'd spend the night, they'd service the airplane. The next day they'd get up and fly off to wherever they were headed to. So that's the first piece. Well, by early 1941, the United States is starting to transport B-17 bombers to Philippines. And they decide that Wake Island would be a great place to do that from. And so what they're going to do is they're going to build an airfield. They're going to fortify the island. So they bring in 1,200 civilian contractors to do this work. So there's 1,200 contractors on there, and they're going to, like I said, they're going to build the airfield. They're going to make a channel. That's what I got that circle there for, in order to get into the nice secluded areas. They get bigger ships in there. And of course, they're going to help fortify it. And what they're fortifying for is the 1st Marine Defense Battalion. The 1st Marine Defense Battalion is basically not an infantry unit like we would think of Marines normally being. It's a unit that's for shore defense. And so they are armed with 6 5-inch guns. And where did they get those 5-inch guns? They got them from the old battleship Texas. So as always, when the Navy is done with something, the Marines get the cast-offs. So that's the way it works. Anyway, so they got those 6 guns. They've got 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, and they have 48 heavy and light machine guns. So you can see, for a group of only 450 people, that's a lot of heavy armament. So once again, like I said, they don't have a lot of combat infantry. Well, if you look at this picture, you can see how defended Wake Island actually is. There's a lot of shore batteries. There's a lot of defense that's gone on into Wake Island. It's not completed by December of 1941, but it's pretty far along. Well, it doesn't actually become an air base until just a few days before Pearl Harbor, because the Enterprise, our aircraft carrier, has delivered a Marine fighter squadron of 12 F4F3 Wildcats. So, but the good news is about this, the Enterprise was due back in Pearl Harbor on December 6th. There's a huge storm. They cannot refuel the Enterprise in this storm. And so the Enterprise is a day late into Pearl Harbor. It doesn't get in until the afternoon of December 7th. So the Enterprise is not destroyed at Pearl Harbor. So it's actually, that storm proved to be very fortuitous for the United States at this time. But that's kind of what Wake looks like. Well, on the morning of the 8th, because they're on the date line, they're across the date line, they get a radio message from Pearl Harbor that Pearl Harbor's under attack. And the commander of the Marine Force, his name is Devereaux, Major Devereaux, he immediately sends up a combat air patrol of 4 Wildcats. He also has everybody man their positions. So he's ready to fight. Unfortunately, they have no radar, and there's a lot of cloud cover. And the Japanese send a bomber force in from the Marshall Islands, naval bombers, same ones I always talk about. And those Nells come in, and they hit that airfield hard. They destroy 7 of the 12 Wildcats on the ground. They damage another one. They kill, I believe, they kill or wound 34 of the 55 Marine personnel on the island. So that these are the people that maintain the aircrafts. So it's yes.
Construction people still on the island?
Oh, yes. The construction people will only leave as Japanese prisoners. We'll talk about that. But so what happens then, of course, is the Japanese are going to continue to bombard the island, trying to soften it up. And that goes on for a couple of days. Now, the Marines have only 5 Wildcats left, but they start to intercept as best they can without radar the incoming Japanese bombers and do shoot a significant amount down. So, but the Japanese are getting ready for this invasion, which will take place on December 11th. And what's probably the most interesting part of this invasion is I think they vastly underestimate what's been done with Wake Island. They are only going to invade with 450 troops. Well, there's 450 Marines on the island, so, and plus 1,200 construction workers. So it's probably not a good enough force to try to take this island. And as you'll see, the Japanese will pay for this mistake. Well, they come in and they begin a shore bombardment from 9,000 yards. So they're firing artillery, naval artillery, and Devereaux says, don't fire back. Well, the Japanese shell for a while, and then they decide, well, there must be nothing on the island. It should be okay. So they sail into 4,500 yards. When they sail into 4,500 yards, they're going to pay the price. Now, I know probably it seems like 4,500 yards is a long distance, but for naval artillery, that's point-blank range. So the U.S. starts to immediately make hits on these Japanese ships. And so many hits on the High-8, it becomes the first major warship lost by the Japanese in World War II. So at this point, the Japanese are realizing, like, we're way too close. We got to get back out of here. So they start to back out and sail, not away, but just out of range. Then 4 Wildcats take off. Now, the Wildcat's not a bomber. It's a fighter plane. But it carries 2 little 100-pound bombs, which is not very effective weaponry against a ship. But a Captain Elrod, he gets a really lucky hit, and he sinks this destroyer, the Kisaragi. Now, the story has always gone that he hit the depth charge racks on the back of the ship. Further research has shown that, in fact, what he did is he dropped that bomb amidships and started a fire. Kisaragi was going to be used for the naval landing. And so it had a lot of munitions for the troops on deck. That catches fire, blows up, and sinks the ship. The other Wildcats, of course, are bombing and strafing. And now the Japanese are forced to withdraw completely. Well, a couple of firsts here. Perhaps the most important thing, really, is that the Japanese lose 2 ships, 2 destroyers, 2 warships. It's the first time the Japanese have had a failure to do one of their goals. And what's, I think, very interesting too is this is the only time in the history of World War II where shore batteries have defeated a naval landing. It never happens again in World War II. So this is the only time it will ever occur. Now, there's a famous story that comes out of this, and it says, "Send us more Japs." So that Wake tells Pearl Harbor that indeed we've defeated this landing. And Pearl Harbor is now going to try to get a force in there to reinforce the island and protect it. They also want to know, what do the people on the island really need the most? And so they send a message back. Now, when they do messages in code at this time, they do a thing called padding. They will add a nonsense phrase in there. Well, they add this nonsense phrase that says, "Send us more Japs." Well, the message hits Pearl. People are like, wow, these guys are really tough. You know, they want more Japs to kill, you know, and they make a big propaganda thing out of this. Goes, you know, nationwide in the United States, that these brave Marines are so tough that they want more Japanese to kill. Well, unfortunately, the people on Wake Island find out about this, and they're not particularly happy, because the last thing they absolutely need is more Japs at this particular time. So a kind of an interesting story, I thought, for this time. So anyway, they're going to get more Japs. So the Japanese, remember that Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor, is on its way back to Japan. Well, when they're on their way back to Japan, they're not that far from Wake Island. And they're going to detach 2 carriers to help take Wake Island. Excuse me. They're also going to change the amount of naval troops they're going to land up to 1,500. So you see that the Japanese are taking this island very seriously at this point. Well, what's the U.S. going to do is they're going to send the Saratoga as a covering force. They're going to use a seaplane carrier called the Tangier as a cargo ship. The reason they're using it as a cargo ship is because it's fast. So it's hope to get in, drop off supplies, take a bunch of those construction workers off the island, and get out of Dodge. And they're going to use the Saratoga as cover. So that's the plan. They also send a diversionary force with the Lexington to attack the Marshalls. Well, the Saratoga Task Force is limited in speed originally because of the oiler Neches. And the Neches is slowed down this task force. Well, by the time they're getting close to Wake Island, they now realize that there is a Japanese carrier force nearby, and the decision by Admiral Pai. Remember, Kimmel has been relieved of command. Nimitz has not gotten to Hawaii yet, so Pai is actually in command of Hawaii at this time briefly, and he makes the decision to withdraw. So now Wake Island is basically on its own. All they have is what they've started with. Well, the Japanese are going to bombard using the carriers Wake Island for 11 days. They're now using dive bombers. We talked about those last time, well, actually in Pearl Harbor. The Val, and the Vals are much more accurate than level bombing. They begin to destroy piece by piece by piece the defenses on the island. So all their major artillery is wrecked. It's not a big island. It's not easy to hide things. So also, the Zeros are there, and there's only 5 Wildcats against all these Zeros, and all the Wildcats eventually are destroyed. And you can see a picture of that was Captain Elrod's, a Wildcat at Wake. Well, 2:30 in the morning, the Japanese are going to launch their assault on Wake Island. What they're going to do this time is they're going to take 2 patrol boats, and they're literally going to run them up on the shore. They're not designed to be landing craft, but they're trying to get more troops on the island as fast as they can. And Marines put up a fight. A lot of the construction workers aid in this fight. They pass ammunition, help dig trenches, whatever. So they're basically, a lot of these guys volunteer really to be combatants. But unfortunately, the position of Wake Island is hopeless. They're surrounded by the Japanese Navy. They really don't have a chance. And the decision is made around noontime to surrender the island. The commander of the actual island is a man named Cunningham. He sends the famous message out, enemy on island, issue in doubt. While fighting as an infantryman, Captain Elrod is killed by the Japanese, and he becomes the first Marine pilot to receive the Medal of Honor. Well, at this point, you might wonder what happens to the people on Wake Island. The vast majority are taken to Japanese prisoner of war camps, where they are treated incredibly poorly, of course. They're basically used as slave labor. Well, 93 of them are left behind to be slave labor on Wake Island. Throughout World War II, we never recapture Wake Island. We just bypass it. The Japanese can't reinforce it, particularly later in the war. What few airplanes they did station there are all lost early. And Wake becomes basically a place for target practice. So as our fleet goes out with untrained people, they use it to kind of give people a little sense of combat. So basically the Japanese will fire up a few anti-aircraft rounds and people will drop their bombs or they'll shell the island. Well, one day, a large task force shows up and begins to shell the island. The Japanese assume that we're going to do a landing, that we're going to retake the island. And at that point, they execute those 93 people that were left on the island. So it's another major atrocity of the Japanese in World War II, that they executed these guys for really no good reason. Yes, Jim?
Was that the construction workers?
It was, yes, mostly were construction workers.
But were there soldiers?
I believe there few were soldiers, but most were construction workers. I can't tell you the exact number. Yes, Helen?
Where did the construction workers come from? Were they Hawaiian or?
I believe they were U.S.
That's a long way to send them.
Get what you get.
Sucks.
Yeah, I'd have to look up the exact company, but I believe they're primarily from the U.S. That's my recollection. So, anyway, well, let's talk about a War Plan Orange. A War Plan Orange, and orange signifies the Japanese. We also have a War Plan Black that signifies the Germans. So the idea of these war plans is that we have to have a plan to fight an individual enemy. So War Plan Orange would mean we're only fighting Japan with no allies on our side or their side. So it's just us versus them. And that's where they come up with these war plans. The original war plan starts in 1905. By 1924, they're up to War Plan Orange 3. And War Plan Orange 3 is about the port of Manila. This is much like the British Singapore strategy. It's almost identical, really. That we are going to use the port of Manila as a forward base to fight a war with the Japanese. But we realize that we're not going to be able to do that right away. So the idea of this plan is that we're going to deny that port to the Japanese for 6 months until, of course, the United States fleet in the Atlantic can move to the Pacific, then make one big fleet, fight their way across the Pacific, and relieve Manila. They assume that will take 6 months. Of course, that's the same plan the Japanese are expecting us to do with building those unsinkable aircraft carrier islands, and they're basically, the same idea. There's no difference there, really. So, but you can see the port of Manila is a really good port. It's a lot like I said, like Singapore, and that's the idea there. So after we destroy and take this port back, we now have a place where we can base our entire fleet that's way west in the Pacific, and then they will fight a big battle off the Japanese islands. We will blockade Japan, and Japan will be forced to surrender. Much like the Singapore thing, there's never, ever a plan to invade Japan with ground troops, not the home islands. So really, really similar idea here. And the Japanese are well aware of this. So, well, we need to talk about this guy. And I will tell you straight out, I don't have a lot of respect for this gentleman. Yes, he does some good things. There's no question of that. But I think he best term I can say is he lacks integrity. And we will talk more about this as goes along. Well, anyway, we have told the Philippines that we have given them made them semi-autonomous in 1935. And we've told the Philippine people that they will be a sovereign country in 1946. They will be their own country. They will not be part of the United States any longer. Of course, hopefully they'll be allies, but in fact, that's the idea. So the president of the Philippines is a man named Quezon. And Quezon says, well, you know, we're going to need an army. And we've got 11 years to get ourselves together as a sovereign nation. And he says, we need somebody to run that army. And what they're going to do is, at this point, Douglas MacArthur is head of the United States Army. He's a major hero from World War I. But his time in that position is up. Well, there's really nowhere in the Army he can go at this point because he's already at the top. So generally, when you reach that position, your time is up, you retire. So Quezon reaches out to the United States government and says, you know, we'd really like to hire Douglas MacArthur. And everybody agrees to this. They said, okay, because Douglas actually kind of grew up in the Philippines. His father was a general then. And so the deal is done, and they make him a field marshal, which is a really grandiose title, okay, because there are no field marshals in the United States Army. And I'm sure, knowing Doug, that he thought that was a great title. He probably enjoyed that, being, hey, I'm a field marshal. You know. So Quezon. He's not in the U.S. Army technically anymore. He's technically retired, and he is now part of the Philippine Army. He's a contractor. Well, I guess. I'm not really sure if he's a contractor, but whatever, he's in the Philippine Army. So he starts training the new army, but it doesn't even start training it until 1937. The new army has no budget to speak of, only $6 million. So by 1941, very, very little has been done compared to the amount of time that they have to get ready for this. So it's not really gone as well as they had hoped. Well, but MacArthur comes up with an idea, particularly later, and says, you know, I don't really think War Plan Orange 3 is a really good idea. I think that I can be part of what's known as the Rainbow Plans. The Rainbow Plans are basically our plans for World War II. It assumes that we have allies and we're fighting multiple opponents. And he says, you know, I can train that army and we can defend the Philippines on the beaches. We can defeat the Japanese on the beach. And the United States government is kind of like, maybe he's got something here. You know, this might not be a bad idea. So instead of being in a defensive posture, be in a much more aggressive posture with defending the beaches. Well, remember, the United States, because of what's going on with the invasion of Indochina by the Japanese, now they know that they're in position to attack Malaya, etc. We know that the war clouds are certainly coming. And the United States is now going to reverse its entire strategy. They're going to basically throw War Plan Orange 3 out the window and adopt the Rainbow Plan with MacArthur's caveat. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start reinforcing the Pacific Islands. And the first thing we do is we put Doug back in the U.S. Army. And he's going to be in charge of this Far Eastern force. So he's the head of not just the Philippine Army, but our army as well in the Far East. And he's going to have his headquarters, of course, in Manila. Well, the U.S. then begins to reinforce the Philippines. We're starting to send our best aircraft, our best fighters, our best bombers. We're starting to send more and more things to the Philippines. And the idea of this is to prevent aggression by the Japanese. It's the same idea that the British used with Singapore by sending the battlecruiser Repulse and the battleship Prince of Wales. It's going to be a deterrent to the Japanese. That's the goal of this. So let's prevent the war by building up our strength. Well, the Navy looks at this plan and they say, oh, no, bad plan, because if we send all this stuff to the Philippines, how are we going to support it? The Japanese control this part of the ocean. We can't get cargo ships and stuff in there. So what it really becomes is a political decision. It's not a good, sound military decision to do this. It's the hope that we can send enough force in there to prevent Japanese aggression. Well, I'm sure by now everybody realizes that's not necessarily a great idea. So what are we going to send them? First thing we're going to send them is our best fighter plane at this time, the P-40B. P-40B is a relatively fast aircraft. It's faster than a Japanese Zero, for example. It is very sturdy. It can take a lot of damage and survive. It's relatively well armed. It's got a couple of problems, though. The first problem, I think, is that it has a single-stage supercharger, so its high-altitude performance is not really good. At high altitude, it loses a lot of power. It can get to high altitude, but it's not a good performer at that level. The other issue is the design of its cockpit. It doesn't give a lot of visibility to its pilot. The pilot's kind of enclosed in this thing. He can't really see around really well. So it's got another problem. A big problem, too, is it's not particularly maneuverable. And Japanese aircraft are really maneuverable. So we talked about the Flying Tigers. And the head of the Flying Tigers is a guy named Claire Chennault. Claire has been in China for years. And he has seen Japanese aircraft. And he knows all about the Zero. And he tells the U.S., he goes, never dogfight with a Zero. So the idea should be is you can use this aircraft effectively if you get above the Zeros, you dive into them and then try to make a turn and come back again. If the Zero is above you, because this airplane is faster and dives better than a Zero, is to dive and get the hell out of Dodge, because you're not going to fight them otherwise. Well, by the time of Pearl Harbor, we have sent 91 of these are operational in the Philippines. Okay? The next aircraft we send is our absolute best bomber at this time. It's probably the best long-range bomber in the world, the B-17. But these are very early B-17s. These are B-17Ds. Notice the tail fin. Very different than what we're used to seeing on a B-17. But it's still fast, it has long range, and it's really sturdy. Okay, it can take a hell of a lot of damage. It's not as defensible as the ones we're used to seeing in World War II over Germany. Notice it doesn't have a tail gun. It doesn't have a belly turret. It doesn't have a chin turret. The thing on the top is not a turret. That is an observation dome to take star sightings for the navigator. So it's not nearly as well defended as the ones we're used to. But again, it is a great bomber. But how many have we sent to the Philippines? Only 34. Not a lot. Not a lot as a deterrent. So again, we see that this effort is if we had more time, I guess, because there were B-17s actually landing at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked that were going to the Philippines. So with more time, this would have been probably built up better, but I doubt it would have deterred them because it's just too big a commitment. Well, what else do we send them? We send them 108 of these M3 Stuarts and two battalions of these things. So we send a decent amount of tanks. Again, a big commitment for the U.S. because we don't have that many tanks for our own uses. So we send them tanks. MacArthur is trying to build up this army finally, but really by the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, he's only got really 31,000 well-trained quality troops, counting U.S. forces. And 12,000 of those are what's known as Philippine Scouts. These are excellent troops and highly motivated. So, but it's, again, he doesn't have that much force power that's trained. Well, he's going to try to create 10 new Philippine Army divisions. And on September 1st, he calls up one regiment. There's 3 regiments in a division. On November 1st, he calls up another regiment. The last regiment for these units is not called up until after Pearl Harbor. So these units are not well trained. They're not well armed. But they're doing the best they possibly can, as you'll see. But again, they're not really ready for prime time. And a big problem is they take officers from the Philippine Scouts to disperse into these units to help them get up to snuff as quickly as possible. The problem is there's multiple languages in the Philippines. And these units are created in local positions, which is standard. Germans do the same thing, for example. We have National Guard, the same idea. But so their officers don't necessarily speak the same language as their troops. It's going to be a huge problem for them in order to train these people up. So we see right off the bat that the Philippine Army is at a huge disadvantage to the Japanese at this point. Well, the U.S. fleet that's available here really isn't much of a fleet. It's really just a small unit, and it's designed to protect our interests, protect cargo ships, etc. The admiral that's in charge of this unit, Admiral Hart, he's really, I'm not saying he's a bad admiral, but he's really more of a diplomat. So he's there to, show the flag and tell everybody hi. And, so it's a little tiny fleet. It's certainly not capable of fighting the Japanese in any way. They're stationed at the Cabot Naval Base, which is in Manila Harbor. And it's our only repair facility west of Pearl Harbor. So that's, again, why the whole idea of Warplane Orange was to maintain this base. Well, they've got 2 cruisers, they got a few destroyers, but mostly what they have is submarines. They have 29 submarines, and those submarines are going to be used for shore defense. So the idea is that our submarines will protect the Philippine Islands, that they will sink enough Japanese transports and cargo ships, and that's the main strength of our force in this area. Well, we'll have another class about submarines next semester, but needless to say, our submarines do not perform very well, and we will go into great detail about that next time. So, well, what's the Japanese plan? And the Japanese plan is simply they're going to have 3 major invasions on the island of Luzon. That's where Manila is. They are going to have another smaller invasion on Mindanao. But the idea is they have to take Luzon. That's the key piece. And if you look at the map, for future reference, I've marked where Formosa or Taiwan is up at the top circle. And then I've drawn an arrow down to where Manila and Clark Airfield, etc., are located. And keep that in mind because that's a distance of approximately 600 miles. Well, so the Japanese, they're going to use 2 crack divisions. The 16th is a naval landing division. It's a lot of combat power. The other division is the 48th. Again, another well-trained, well-armed, a lot of combat veterans from China. And they're also going to give them a lot of extra stuff. They're going to give them extra tanks, extra engineers, extra anything they needed in order to make this a successful invasion. And they're also going to supply 200 Army aircraft. Like the U.S., the Japanese Army has a separate air force from the Japanese Navy. Well, what's the Japanese Navy doing? Well, they're going to supply 42 major warships. They're going to have a small aircraft carrier. But the most important thing they're going to provide is a thing called the 11th Koku Kantai, or the 11th Air Fleet. And there's over 100 bombers in this air fleet, and these guys are good. These are Navy bombers with really long range. And these guys are excellent. This is the same kind of a group that destroyed, not the same group, but the same type of group that destroyed the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. Really good. They're also going to have a large contingent of deadly Zeros. And this particular air fleet has contributed, I would believe, the vast majority of Japanese fighter aces in World War II. Many of the most famous, certainly, fighter aces come from this unit. So it's a really, really, really good unit, and they're going to provide a lot of aircraft. So how many total aircraft are the Japanese going to use in this? 500 frontline aircraft. Again, we've got 91 fighters and 34 B-17s, some P-35s. The Philippine Army is actually using old P-26P shooters. So the Japanese are going to have vastly more air power to begin this battle. So we're going to talk now about the thing called the other Pearl Harbor. And so 5 a.m., December 8th, MacArthur is told that Pearl Harbor is bombed. And a political decision is once again made here that because the Philippines are semi-autonomous, and this is between MacArthur and Quezon, that indeed they are not going to take any overt acts against the Japanese until the Japanese strike first. Probably a bad idea. So that's what they do. Now, there's a General Brereton, and he's got his own problems in Europe, believe me, but we'll give him a pass today. And he goes to MacArthur and wants to talk to MacArthur and says, I want to launch a strike. MacArthur won't see him. This guy waits for hours and waiting outside MacArthur's office to talk to MacArthur. And MacArthur will not talk to him. Doesn't want to talk. So, and he wants to launch an immediate strike with the B-17s he has available on Formosa. Well, finally he gets in to see MacArthur, and MacArthur says, well, you know what you can do? You can send one B-17 as a reconnaissance aircraft. And in the meantime, you can load up the other B-17s potentially for a bombing strike. And so they're doing that. Now, they launched a large combat air patrol of P-40s, a big force, flying around Clark Field and Iba Field. No Japanese. Well, they've been flying around for hours. They're running out of fuel. So they decide they got to land, refuel the planes. Well, it's lunchtime. So might as well refuel the planes and have some lunch. And that's what they do. Well, another bad plan. Because the few fighters that are airborne fail to intercept a large force of Japanese bombers. Now, you may wonder, where are the Japanese bombers all this time? Why are they so late? Why does it take till noon to launch this raid? Well, what happens is the Japanese originally planned to launch an attack at dawn. It's foggy, really foggy over Formosa. They can't launch. And the Japanese pilots around the ground are literally freaking out. They're going, man, we got to get up in the air because the U.S. is going to bomb us on the ground. We're going to be in trouble. And they're like, got to get up, got to get up. Finally, they launched this big strike. And it's a big strike. I mean, for Clark Field, they're going to have 27 Nells. That's the Nell. That's the predecessor to the Betty. It's a long-range naval bomber, medium bomber that can either be used to drop a torpedo or bombs. And they're also going to have 26 Bettys. They come over Clark Field. They drop their bombs. The bombing is incredibly successful. And then 0 fighters strafe the airfield for 30 minutes. They virtually destroy all the P-40s that were. There were some up in the air. They destroy those, and they just shoot the heck out of the airfield, right? So they basically knock out 12 of the 17 B-17s that are on the ground are destroyed. 3 are really badly damaged. So basically the B-17 force is basically out of commission. They destroy the 20th Pursuit Squadron. Remember, we use the term in aircraft at this time, fighter aircraft says P-51 instead of F, because at this time we refer to fighter squadrons as pursuit squadrons. So those guys are destroyed. At Iba Field, they're caught on the ground and landing. They're destroyed. So what has occurred in 45 minutes? Half of the air power of the Philippine Islands is destroyed in 45 minutes. Should have been aware of what was going on. Knew that Pearl Harbor was attacked hours earlier. And it gets so bad that after 2.5 days, they actually have to abandon Clark Field as a bomber base because the Japanese have complete air superiority over the island. So it's a disaster. What happens? Well, remember at Pearl Harbor, Kimmel gets sacked, Short gets sacked, right? Here, no investigation. No problems for Macarthur or Brereton. They walk away scot-free from this disaster. Now, if we look at this realistically, could they have destroyed the Japanese 500 aircraft with what, 140 we had? Not even. So could they have really defended it totally? Probably not. But the fact is they could have done a heck of a lot better job than losing half their Air Force on the first 45 minutes of the war. So probably I would think that there should have been some repercussions for the way that this was so badly mishandled. Yes.
It just sounds like.
All right, well, the Japanese Zero, perhaps one of the most iconic aircraft in history, relatively fast, relatively well armed. You'll notice that the cockpit on this aircraft, you can see all around you, unlike the P-40. It's just really a great aircraft. It's maneuverable as hell. It has a great rate of climb. It's got one other, though, gigantic advantage. It's got incredible range. It's the right aircraft for the Pacific because everything is such a long range. So it can go with that belly tank you can see on there, 1,900 miles. As far as combat radius, it has a combat radius of over 600 miles. With a combat radius of over 600 miles, it can fly out 600 plus, fight a battle, and then fly back. It's an incredible aircraft, and many people feel that this is one of the key reasons that the Japanese were able to gain air superiority at such great distances in the early part of World War II. For example, over Singapore, for example, here, you'll see that this plane has the range in order to do a lot of damage and gain air superiority. So it's a really, really great fighter aircraft, and certainly was a key reason why the Japanese were able to do as much as they did. It had such long range that frequently the Allies would assume there must be aircraft carriers around because there's no way this aircraft could be there. No other fighter, for example, a range on a Messerschmitt or a Spitfire, they had less than a 300-mile combat radius, less than 300. This has over 600. So it is an incredible advantage, particularly in the Pacific with great distances, that this aircraft had this capability. So that's one of the big reasons I think the Japanese were so successful early on in the war. Well, talked about air superiority, and perhaps one of the most devastating raids in history, especially for such a small number, is going to be the destruction of the Cabot Naval Yard. Again, only 54 bombers. When we think of raids later in World War II, there are huge amounts of aircraft. But again, there's no defense. Really, basically the U.S. fighters are gone by the 10th. And the anti-aircraft guns that we have are 3-inch guns. They're old. They fire obsolete ammunition that's not in good condition. And basically these Japanese bombers are untouched at 18,000 feet when they drop their bombs. So what happens here? It is amazing how much damage they are going to do to this naval yard, but just 54 bombers. They start huge fires. They sink a submarine, the Sea Lion. They damage a bunch of other ships. But most importantly, they destroy 200 torpedoes. Now, that's all the torpedo reloads we had for the submarines that are going to defend the Philippine Islands. So now when they shoot their torpedoes and they're out of torpedoes, they have to either go back to Pearl Harbor or to Australia. Yes, Jim?
Bombing so accurate that they were 18,000 feet.
Because they were just damn good.
And what sort of bomb sites were they using?
Pretty primitive. They were just good. They practiced a lot, and they were combat vets. It's the best I can tell you. It wasn't really like they had a Norden bomb site or anything. It's just they did a hell of a job. They really were effective. They bombed a lot of Chinese. So because the Army Air Force cannot defend the base, the idea is they're going to evacuate all the surface ships. So as we talked about last week with the Battle of the Java Sea, the surface ships that leave Manila go to Java and then are basically destroyed there. So that's where those ships had come from originally, because they can't defend this anything really from the air. Japanese have air superiority. Well, the Japanese, we talked a little bit about their plans for the invasion, and this is how it's going to take place. So on December 8th, they're going to attack a place called Batan Island. This is not the Batan Peninsula. Okay? 2 days later, they're going to actually invade northern Luzon. So they already have ground troops on Luzon, not anywhere near Manila, but certainly on the island. And on that second raid, we still have some combat power with the few B-17s left and the few fighters, and they launch a strike against the Japanese fleet. It's relatively successful, one of the few bright spots. They hit a couple of transports, they sink a minesweeper, they hit a Japanese cruiser, and they do some damage. But after that, of course, the B-17s are now going to be withdrawn because Clark Field is uninhabitable all the way to Australia. It's a long way away from Manila. Well, so basically that first week, the Japanese have achieved pretty much everything they were looking to achieve. So they've got this first invasion. The big invasion is going to come here at Lingayen Gulf. And that invasion takes place on December 22nd. They're going to land 43,000 troops, 90 tanks. This is their big invasion. Problems, though, is that the Japanese Navy misses the landing beaches, kind of like what happened at Utah in Normandy. But they missed by 4 miles. So the Japanese are landing in the wrong place. The waves are really rough. Boats are capsizing. It's getting to be a disaster. Okay, it's really a problem. The Japanese, this is not going well. All right. Well, you would think this was the golden opportunity for that beach defense that Macarthur claimed he could do with Rainbow 5. Unfortunately, the people that he's got in this position are some of his least trained troops. He has 3 divisions, but remember, each one of those divisions is only really 2/3 of a division because they're missing a whole regiment. They're not well trained, they're not well armed, and the 71st Division actually has only been activated for 10 weeks. So it's not real good, to put it bluntly. There is one good force there. It's the 26th Cavalry of the Philippine Scouts. And they put up a hell of a fight at a town called Rosario. But again, this is one small unit against 43,000 Japanese. So they do the best they can, but indeed they're forced to retreat. So the Japanese invasion's going really well. The U.S. submarines, they only sink 2 transports. This was the main naval defense that we had, was these submarines. They don't do a good job for a lot of reasons, and we'll get there. Not today. So they get 4 B-17s. Okay, now here's the deal. They fly all the way from Australia. They land on Mindanao. They refuel on Mindanao and then go and attack the Japanese naval force. 4. Not effective at all. So on that first day, the Japanese have taken a landing field or landing area 10 miles wide, 15 miles wide by 10 miles deep. They've actually met up with the troops all the way up in the north. So it's going great. It shouldn't have gone great, but it is going great. Much better than probably they could have expected. They don't bother to consolidate the beachhead. They just rush inland, and it pays off for them. Well, that 71st Division I talked about, they're heavily attacked, and they break and run. They abandon their equipment and head for the hills. So at this point, the general that's in charge of Luzon, the U.S. general, is a man named Wainwright. He is under, remember, Macarthur is in charge of the Far East, so he's in charge of all of the Philippines. Wainwright reports to Macarthur, and he tells Macarthur, look, we can't hold the beaches. We need to withdraw up to a river line to try to make a defensive stand. And so Macarthur is forced to acquiesce to this. Well, what's happening in the south is that 16th Division is going to land 7,000 troops at a place called Lamon Bay. And that's a day later. So the idea is the Japanese are going to come from the north, from Lingayen Gulf, and they're going to come from the south, from Lamon Bay, and they're going to put a pincer movement on Manila. Well, the defenses here are relatively poor. For example, the general in charge of this area is a man named Parker. He has no artillery to speak of. He's got a lot of untrained troops, but he makes a classic military mistake. He disperses his troops all over different areas and to cover a lot of beaches. And I believe it was Napoleon that said, "He who defends everything defends nothing." And that's exactly what happens here. So the Japanese now virtually land unopposed. They don't face any real opposition except roadblocks and blown bridges, and they're rapidly moving north. Well, at this point, Macarthur is forced to take Rainbow 5 and throw it out the window because he hasn't defended any of the beaches. So his plan for Rainbow is totally gone, and he decides he's going to resort to War Plan Orange 3. Of course, they haven't prepared for War Plan Orange 3, have they? So they're in a tough spot. The Japanese are rapidly advancing, and what they're going to do is 2 units going to stand out again. That 26th Cavalry and the 194th Tank Battalion are going to hold the road open that leads from Manila, from the south, in order for people to get into the Batan Peninsula. Remember, that was the original plan. They would defend the Batan Peninsula and use those forts in the harbor and hold out for 6 months until the U.S. fleet could, get there and relieve them. So all they can do is, again, they hold that road open for 9 days. That allows a lot of troops that would have been trapped into this peninsula. There's other problems, though. They don't have the capability to move a lot of weapons, a lot of ammunition, and particularly a lot of food into this area. So by the time those days expire, and Manila is going to fall. It's going to be an open city. I believe it falls on the 2nd. So they don't defend Manila. So it's captured relatively quickly. So the supplies that are in Manila can't really get here. So they only have food for 40,000 men for 6 months. Unfortunately, they've got 70,000 men plus 21,000 civilians that should have been evacuated had they run this plan properly. And now this entire force from day one on this peninsula has to go on half rations. So again, lack of planning is a disaster here. And you can see the red lines. That's where they're going to, the fallback position will be called the Wk.5 line. Well, like I said, Manila is occupied and they fall back on Wk.5. Well, January 7th rolls around and the Japanese are probing this line, and they're become a little overconfident. They're thinking, well, things have gone so great. We've captured Manila. We've got these guys penned in. They're going to break and run, so no big deal. So we're going to take that 48th Division. We're going to put it back on ships, and we're going to take it to invade Java. They also pull out 200 Army aircraft. Well, what they give Homa, he's the general in charge of the Japanese invasions, General Homa. Homa gets a thing called the 65th Brigade. The 65th Brigade is anything but the 48th Division. It is a bunch of reservists. They're older. They're not well motivated. They're not really well trained. And it's only a brigade versus a division. So it's really a garrison force. And now he's forced to use this garrison force to attack. Now he still has the 16th Division, which is quite good. Well, the Wk.5 line, if you look at the map, is actually split in two. And the reason is
Frank, maybe you should tell them what a garrison force is.
Oh.
People sitting around in desks and headquarters, they're not.
They're to keep civil order. A garrison force is to basically maintain order in the area. It's like a 2 steps above a police force, basically what they are. Okay, thank you. All right, so Now we've got this line, but there's a big mountain in the middle. And they decide that they can't get through that mountain. The U.S. decides it's impenetrable. But once again, the Japanese are going to use light infantry force to try to penetrate this area. But that force gets lost. So they're wandering around on this mountain for days. And what really changes here, though, all of a sudden, the Philippine army is fighting a lot better. They're fighting hard. The Japanese are really starting to get concerned that the Philippine army is doing, they expected these guys to act like Malaya, where they break and run all the time. And that's not happening. The Philippine army is fighting quite well. And so things aren't going quite as well as they'd hope. But what happens is that little force of light infantry finally winds its way through the mountain and gets in behind the Abuque line. And at this point, Wainwright becomes concerned about being encircled, only on half of it. But he now realizes he's going to have to retreat to the Orion-Bagak line, which you can see that big black arrow and the little hash marks going across the peninsula. So that's where they're going to retreat to, because this little force has gotten through behind him. Well, so that's where they are gone. And I keep talking about light infantry, and I couldn't basically talk about light infantry without talking about how the Japanese achieve what they do with what they have to work with. So they don't have the industrial capability to really build Western-style divisions with heavy artillery and a lot of trucks and a lot of logistics to move all this stuff around. So what they do is they create these light infantry forces, and they're quite good. But they need weapons for suppression fire. Okay, since you don't have artillery, what are you going to use? They create this thing. It's called the Type 89 mortar. It's commonly referred to in the United States as a knee mortar. And it's quite an ingenious little invention. It only weighs 10 pounds. It fires a 50 millimeter shell, not like our mortars where you drop them down the tube with fins and go fly at big things. You can see the guy on the left there. He's holding two of these little shells in his hands. That little shell is a rifled shell. It's not, again, it's just not dropped down the tube. It's fitted in, and then it's actually fired with a trigger. So that thing can fire those little shells 650 meters. Again, out of a little 10-pound tube. It's pretty.
Breech loading.
Yes. Or it can be loaded from the tube with grenades, which I'll get to. So, and I'll try to find it. I have a really good video on it somewhere. I'll try and send it to you.
Is he pulling that trigger?
Yes, he is. He's pulling the trigger. So anyway, it fires also the standard Japanese grenade. It doesn't fire it nearly as far. But what they do is they take a standard grenade and they put a little lift charge on it and put it in the barrel and then fire it. Now, why is that such a huge advantage? Because everybody in your unit's carrying grenades. So you just go around, these guys go around, well, hey, we need some grenades. So everybody give us one grenade. And that's what they do. So everybody now is carrying ammunition for this weapon. Not to mention that the lift charges don't weigh very much. So again, it's all much more portable than U.S. heavy stuff would be. Well, with all these advantages, it's got another advantage. It can be used in the jungle firing grenades. So if there's a canopy above me, it doesn't have to be, obviously if it's heavy canopy, it ain't going to work. But if it's a light canopy above me where I'd be afraid to fire a mortar shell because if I fire a mortar shell up and it hits a branch and it blows up in my face. But if I'm firing grenades, the grenades aren't activated until they come out of the tube. So it can punch through. It's not going to go real far. But again, you don't have to be afraid of it blowing up over your head. So it's another huge advantage in jungle situations to be able to use this little weapon. Well, why do you want to have this weapon? Because you want suppression fire. So what does that mean? Normally, if people are in a trench or a foxhole and they're shooting at you, what are you going to do? You're going to fire either machine guns or artillery to make them duck so they can't shoot at you. Well, you don't have that with the Japanese, so they need something to create suppression fire, and they use this little mortar. And it's highly, highly effective. Now, I know you've been waiting. Why do they call it a knee mortar? Okay. Well, the thought originally was, because there's a little curved base on it, that you would take it and put it on your leg and fire it that way. If you do take it and put it on your leg and fire that way, you will break your leg. So the reason it's called a knee mortar, most people believe, is the Japanese carried it in a little bag on the side of their leg. And so it hung down by their knee. So hence the term knee mortar. A clever design and very suitable for light infantry tactics. That brings us to the Battle of the Pockets and the Points. And we now see that they are retreating to the Orion Bagak line, the U.S. and Philippine forces. Well, what happens is the Japanese aggressively pursue them. And a force of Japanese, around 2,000 men, gets in behind the line. And you can see that in the square on the picture there. So Battle of the Pockets. If you look at that square, that's where these guys are in behind the line. Well, unlike Malaya, they don't break and run like the Indian troops did. They attack this pocket aggressively, and they surround the Japanese in the pocket. So now the Japanese are in trouble. And this battle is going to go on from January 23rd until February 17th. Okay, so they've got 2,000 Japanese surrounded. The Japanese 16th Division launches numerous attacks to free these guys. And they're almost all of them, right until the end, are defeated. So it's amazing how well that the Philippine army is fighting at this point. Remember, they didn't fight very well at the beginning, but they've gotten better and better and better. And they resist these attacks for a long time. Then finally, on February 15th, the 16th Division breaks through to the remnants of this unit and rescue 370. So out of 2,000 men, only 370 are rescued by the Japanese 16th Division. Now, I want you also to look at this map and notice I have a big circle there called the Battle of the Points. Also notice that there's a circle lower right-hand corner that says Corregidor Island. So you see that now Corregidor Island isn't really very far from where the Japanese are going to have a naval landing. And there's something on Corregidor Island that's going to make that Japanese landing a little bit more dicey than the Japanese thought. And that's going to be the 12-inch 1890 mortar. That little devil doesn't have a lot of range. It fires a 900-pound plus explosive shell. So basically, it's designed to fire with armor-piercing shells against battleships. They've gotten themselves in range of this thing.
Is there only one?
No, there's batteries of them, usually 4 to a battery. So I can't remember the exact number on Corregidor. I would say it was probably 12, but it's so long since I've really looked at that map. But they had these they're in a hole, really. Not a trench, and they call it a battery, and they'll put 4 guns in a battery, and then the idea is they're not particularly accurate, so they fire a group of shots to try to hit a ship that's moving. It's not like a flat gun where you just aim it. It's got to arch up, and the idea was that these shells would plunge through the decks of battleships and destroy them. It's an older technology against an 1890s gun, but against infantry, it's mighty damn effective. So the Japanese are going to have this naval landing of about 2,000 troops behind the Orion Bagak line. And it's at night, and they run into a group of USPT boats. The USPT boats sink 2 barges and scatter the rest. So instead of this thing landing as a compact force, they're scattered all over the coastline, as you saw in that map. There was like 3 arrows there. Well, now the Japanese, not only are they in range of this, but they're not well organized. So, but what are we going to do to stop them? Because all our troops are basically up north, and there's not a lot of capacity to, what are they going to do with these Japanese? We don't want them roaming around in the backfield. So they create a scratch force of Cabot naval sailors, from Cabot Naval Base, aircraft personnel, and Philippine constables. So it's a scratch force. And, so they're not trained or anything, but they managed to hold the Japanese in position while most of them are destroyed by artillery fire and lack of ammunition. So of that 2,000 men that landed, only 40 survived. So it's another major disaster for the Japanese. So the points in the pockets have really, really turned the tides on this battle, at least in the short term. Well, Homa's just lost all these troops. He doesn't have the 48th Division, and he realizes that he's in a tough situation. So all he can do at this point is resort to siege warfare. That's his only capability. But he also realizes that he still has to, once he takes Batan, he's still going to have to take those forts. And so he has to appeal to the Japanese government, the military leaders in Japan. I need more troops and I need more weapons. Now remember, the Japanese are doing all these fights on a shoestring. So you've got a huge issue with that. Remember, Yamashita and Malaya didn't get anything extra, and he won. Homa now has to basically go begging for more support. Well, the Japanese need to take the Philippines, particularly Luzon, and that's what they do. So they give him more troops, and they give him a really rare commodity in the Japanese military is heavy artillery. He gets a group of 240 millimeter howitzers. The Japanese have very few of these, and they're reluctant to deploy them. But indeed, he has to have them. So that's what he gets. Well, there's been months of continuous combat. Our troops were on half rations from day one. They're literally starving to death. They have malaria. They're ill. They're in terrible condition. And Roosevelt, on March 12th, orders Macarthur to leave the Philippines along with key personnel. And at this point, I want to talk just a little bit about Mr. Macarthur. First of all, I think that he lacks a lot of integrity. He's spends his time in this battle on the island of Corregidor. He never once goes to the front line to see those troops. He's in a thing called the Malinta Tunnel. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he gets the name from his behavior of Dugout Doug. So he doesn't get a lot of respect from his troops at this point, particularly the troops in the Philippines. One thing I think is probably more disturbing is Quezon is on Corregidor with him. And Quezon and him are going to be evacuated. And Quezon says to him, and I view this more as a bribe than anything else. He says, you did a really great job, and we're going to give you $500,000 for your work in the Philippines as like a bonus. And he gives money out to other leaders of the U.S. Army at this time. Now, $500,000 in 1942 is worth over $9 million today. And Macarthur accepts this. Now, the same offer is made to Dwight Eisenhower when Quezon gets back to the United States, because Eisenhower had served in the Philippines under Macarthur previous to World War II. And Quezon goes to Eisenhower and says, I'm going to give you $60,000, which is over $1 million today. And Eisenhower says, no, I can't accept that. That would be wrong. Okay, it would send the wrong message. It's legal, but I can't accept it. And he doesn't take the money. No one knows that Macarthur has taken $500,000 until 1978. Okay, so I have a lot of issues with the integrity of this gentleman. Philippine Treasury.
Was it was only partially independent, so was that American?
It was U.S. dollars,
Okay.
but it's not American money. It's the Philippine Treasury.
Why was it legal?
I'm sorry?
You said it was legal.
It is legal. There's no reason why Macarthur could not have accepted that money legally. It's the moral issue of accepting it.
Is that still standing in today's military?
I would think not. But I couldn't answer that. I'm not a legal expert.
Paper money or gold?
I don't know. But he got 500,000. I know that much for sure. Yes.
What was the communications? How did the Japanese communicate back to Japan?
Radio.
Units.
Radio.
They had radio.
Oh yeah, they had radios on the ground. The aircraft radio were very poor. Okay, anyway, let me keep it going here. So the units are starving, so much so that 26 cavalry I've talked about several times how bravely they fought, they're forced to eat their horses because they're out of food. So the end is near, let's put it that way. And the Japanese on April 3rd launched their final offensive on Batan. And at that point, a few days later, the battling bastards of Batan are finally have to surrender. And you can see the surrender here. And you can actually see one of the U.S. officers covering his face. And it's a sad situation what's going to happen next. And that's going to be what's known as the Death March of Batan. As I've told you numerous times, the Japanese do not treat prisoners well. They are not expecting to have taken 60,000 prisoners and 20,000 civilians in this place. They need to get them out of the way in order so they can then attack those, the island of Corregidor and the other bases that are defending the forts defending the harbor. And so they basically don't have transport for these people, but they're soldiers. So the Japanese assume that they can walk out. Well, remember, they're starving. They've got disease. And unfortunately, they're not capable of walking out. And the Japanese become enraged that these people aren't doing what they want. And they begin to kill them and torture them on this route. It's believed, no one knows for sure, but between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipino soldiers are killed on this march. About 500 to 650 U.S. soldiers are killed on this march. Remember, we don't have nearly the same large forces that the Philippine Army does. So the percentage is much smaller. But then thousands of these people also will die in Japanese captivity during World War II, because again, the prison camps are terrible. Well, what happens actually is the U.S. doesn't know about this right away. They don't know this has occurred. And a couple of POWs escape. And they meet up with Philippine resistance forces. Eventually, they're evacuated by submarine. And they then get back to the U.S. and they tell this story. And the United States government is very, very hesitant to release this information. Because it's going to cause more atrocities. They're quite confident of that. And you can see from this poster from 1944 that they're showing the death march, and they're talking about stay on the job until every murdering Jap is wiped out. Well, at some point, the U.S. Army has to respond to this, and it's going to be by General George Marshall, who's head of the U.S. Army. He's going to say, these brutal reprisals upon our helpless victims evidence the shallow advance from savagery which the Japanese people have made. We serve notice upon the Japanese military, political leaders, as well as the Japanese people, that the future of the Japanese race itself depends entirely upon irrevocably upon their capacity to progress beyond their aboriginal barbaric instincts. This is quite a racist piece. There's no question about it. But that's the feeling that this generated. So as we'll see, as World War II goes on in the Pacific, the U.S. and versus the Japanese, it will become more and more terrible, exactly for reasons like this, because of Japanese behavior, and our counter to that behavior is not particularly good either. So there's a book I would recommend. It's called War Without Mercy. And it's by Dower. It's in my syllabus. So quite interesting how the war gets basically more and more terrible as it goes on. Well, Now it's time to attack Manila Bay. And the Japanese want to capture those forts. That's all that's left. And we've started building these forts in 1905. And they're basically completed by 1915, the most important being Corregidor. Now, again, they have those mortar pits, those big, giant 12-inch mortars. But most of these things are equipped with rifle artillery to destroy naval ships. And they build this thing. And I think this is one of the more interesting forts in the world. It's called Fort Drum, and it also had the nickname of the concrete battleship. They took a small island and leveled it. They poured reinforced concrete on this thing 26 to 35 feet thick. Then they put 2 battleship turrets, 14-inch gun turrets, on top of this thing. All right. It's virtually impregnable. Okay. You got to realize that's a lot of money to be spending in 1905 to 1915 to build these fortifications. So we started well before the British on Singapore. Well, on Corregidor, Macarthur had his headquarters in this thing called the Malinta Tunnel. It's a large defensive bomb-proof shelter, really what it is. It's so big that it has a 1,000-bed hospital in there. Well, the Japanese have been using aerial bombardment on these forts since the 29th of December. But now they've got those 240 millimeter howitzers. Those howitzers have a longer range than our mortars. So what they're going to do is they're going to put those behind a hill that's out of range of the mortars. Remember, the artillery, the flat firing artillery can't hit them behind the hill. And they're going to begin to bombard the forts with these huge artillery pieces that the Japanese, what few they have, is basically being deployed here. Well, it's quite effective. And the Japanese are using all the artillery they have on Corregidor, and they're landing 16,000 shells a day on this little island. They also use those 240s to great effect. They hit one of those mortar pits, Battery Gary, and it hits its ammunition dump. That ammunition dump blows up and actually throws one of those 12-inch mortars 150 yards out of the pit. So you can see that things are not going well on Corregidor. Again, they don't have any resupply. They're cut off. You know, these guys but they're still fighting. And on May 5th, the night, the Japanese finally land on the island. Now, there's not a lot of, surprisingly, you would think there'd be a lot of combat power on this island. There's not. There's a lot of administrative troops. And there's a lot of wounded in the Malinta Tunnel. And Japanese get 3 tanks on the island, and Wainwright at that decides that they don't have any defense against tanks, and he decides to surrender the island rather than have people slaughtered, particularly the wounded. And he tries to surrender, and the Japanese say, no, we're not accepting your surrender. And he's like, no, we are surrendering. We surrender. And they're like, no, you can't just surrender this. You have to surrender the entire Philippine Islands. He technically doesn't have the capability to do that, but he's under such threats of violence by the Japanese that he makes that decision that he will try to surrender everything, all the other forts, not just Corregidor, for example. So they all surrender at this time. Macarthur's furious. He's totally angry. How dare Wainwright do this? That he should never have surrendered all these forts and all the people on the Philippine Islands. Of course, if you think about it, they're surrounded. They really don't have a chance.
And MacArthur's in Australia.
And MacArthur's in Australia. But he's mad about it. Well, anyway, so when we look at this battle, it delayed the Japanese in their total offensive in the Pacific by approximately 105 days. That gives us the opportunity to reinforce key positions that lead to Australia. For example, New Caledonia is occupied by our forces in this time frame. So the Japanese are delayed. The Japanese are also really angry at General Homa for they view he bungled this attack, unlike Yamashita, who did it with what he had, did it on time, and destroyed those, the forces in front of him. Homa will never again lead troops in battle. He's disgraced in the Japanese army for this event. He will also be executed after World War II for the Batan Death March, but that's another story. Well, I think the biggest difference we see here between what went on in Malaya, what went on in Burma, is that the Philippine army, after those early defeats, fought really well. You never see the amount of fifth column behavior that you would see in Malaya, with Malaysians trying to help the Japanese take it from the British. You never see that here. You don't see it like in Burma, too. Same issues. Well, what's the difference? And I think the difference is simply that the United States had given these people semi-autonomy and had promised them by 1946 that this would be their own country. And I think that made a huge difference of why they didn't buy in nearly as much into the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. And I think it says a lot about the Philippine people fighting for their own country. And with that, thank you all for coming. We'll see you next week.